Okay, great. So welcome everyone. Thanks again. Thank you so much for joining our Engaged Journalism Exchange conversation. And I'm Andrea Wenzel. I'm an assistant professor at Temple University. I'm here with Jake. If you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. I'm Jake Nelson. I'm an assistant professor at the Concrete School at ASU.
And so our goal with these engaged journalism exchange conversations is to try to share experiences and swap ideas, connecting researchers and people interested in engaged journalism as practitioners. We're going to be doing these Zoom chats monthly leading up to the 2021 AEJMC virtual pre-conference on August 3rd. And we'll share more about that later on. But today we're going to focus on lessons learned from some of the many ways news organizations around the US have been attempting to reckon with structural racism's impact on their newsrooms. In a little bit, we'll have a chance for you to share your own experiences in smaller group discussions. But first, we're going to hear perspectives from 3 newsrooms that have been trying to challenge the influence of whiteness in their content and their newsrooms. We'll ask you as you hear things, if you have questions, feel free to drop them into the chat or have conversations there. And we'll have time for Q&A after we hear from the speakers. We're going to do kind of really quick intros from everybody. In a moment, we're going to learn about how Wisconsin Public Radio undertook a source demographic survey, and also how the Seattle Times started a Slack channel to encourage staff to speak up about sensitive issues around race, gender, and inclusion. But first, we're going to share some lessons learned from a recent audit at the Philadelphia Inquirer. I'm actually going to kick this off by sharing some slides here, which I just did, and there we are. Apologies. Too many tabs open. Okay. Oops. No. Present. Okay, there we go. So hopefully you can see the slides now. So I had the honor to co-lead this project with my late colleague, Brian Monroe, who dedicated much of his career to pushing journalism to be more inclusive. This project started out in response to protests by the Inquirer's journalists of color following the publication of the headline "Buildings Matter Too," and as part of that effort, apologies. Thought I had that slide. I do not. So following the publication of the headline "Buildings Matter Too," during their coverage of protests following the killing of George Floyd, journalists of color at the Inquirer called out sick and tired and posted a list of demands, which included accounting for how people of color had been represented in the Inquirer coverage. This led to the formation of a team from Temple University's Klein College, and you can see the team involved some really amazing colleagues in addition to my colleague, Brian Monroe. We had other colleagues from different parts of Temple, but also we had contributions from the Philadelphia Inquirer themselves and the Lenfest local lab. And many of my colleagues are on this call right now, and we'll get to hear from some of them a bit later. And so I'm gonna first hand it off to Tim Tighe from the Inquirer, who is a member of the Inquirer side of the audit team, to share some of what we learned from our quantitative part of the audit. There's a slide, sorry.
Thanks, Andrea. Yeah. Hi, I'm Tim Tighe. I'm a photographer at the Inquirer. As Andrea said, I was part of the audit committee from our newsroom. We kind of gave input and helped Andrea and Brian and their colleagues, to tell them what we were interested in the audit looking at internally in a way that would be, meaningful for the newsroom's purposes. So the audit looked at, they randomly selected 42 days worth of content, which is the equivalent of 6 weeks. It was like, 6 Sundays, 6 Mondays, whatever, over like a year period. That was a total of 3,000 stories, an average of 50 to 90 stories per day, and several very hardworking graduate students cataloged more than 14,000 people who are either mentioned by name or prominently featured in pictures and videos in those stories. Andrea also conducted a number of interviews with staff at the paper. Next. So We're going to go through a lot of charts really fast. Andrea can post the link to the slideshow in the chat afterwards so people can refer back to it. But overall, of all the people mentioned in stories, 61% were white, 23% were Black. Of gender, overwhelmingly male, 76% of all people featured in stories were male, only 22.7% were female. We also were able to break this down by which desk in the newsroom people in stories were mentioned by. And so of all the white people mentioned in stories, 30% were in news, 30% in sports, etc. But in the next slide, you can see that of all the Black people mentioned in stories, the majority were in sports. Over 50% were in sports. And so this is an example of the kind of analysis we can do with this data beyond just the top level look at the breakdown. So this kind of shows us that some of our representation may be skewed. Something else we can do is making sure that we're looking at intersectionality. Of all the Black people featured in stories, 82% were men and only 18% were women. And even if you remove sports stories out of that, because sports teams in Philly that we cover are predominantly male, still 64% of all Black people, for example, were men. So that shows a very glaring gap in our coverage, in not just making sure we have more Black voices in stories, but also Black women specifically are underrepresented. We also tallied up the total number of staff members, newsroom staff members of the paper. As you can see, the newsroom is overwhelmingly white, and 43% of the newsroom is white men. And this is the breakdown by desk. Again, white people dominate most desks in the newsroom. So, kind of one of the conclusions that the audit found was there was a correlation between the race of the reporters and the amount of racial diversity in stories.
Thank you, Tim. So that's just a very quick snapshot. This whole report is about 100 pages. I'm going to give just a very quick snapshot also of the qualitative part that we did to try to contextualize the content analysis. And before that, just to let you know that there's also a mapping component, and Sarah Smallbach from the Lenfest Local Labs, I think, is with us today, might be able to share more, but we wanted to have an opportunity. It does some really interesting things to be able to explore geographic equity of coverage. And if you're interested in that, Sarah can share more later. The qualitative findings, we wanted to kind of understand the context behind the numbers. So we did interviews with 46 staff members, and a few highlights from what we found. So first, when it came to barriers to getting more diverse sources, some said they were not given time to develop sources, or they focused on particular kinds of expertise where white men were overrepresented. When it came to editing practices, journalists of color shared frustrations they had about having to change the framing or style of their stories because an editor was concerned the story would be received by readers who were assumed to be white readers. Regarding community engagement, it was something that was seen as having potential to repair relationships with communities of color, but there was not a shared understanding of who should be doing it. And when it came to who gets to tell, when it came to who gets to tell these stories, there had been progress with recent hires, but some of the desks were still mostly or all white. I think the investigative team was all white. So there were also concerns about pay equity and who gets access to opportunities and mentorship, and people shared experiences of racism in the workplace. And finally, we noted concerns that there was not a culture of talking about race unless there was a problem. So discussions were often reactive and about how to avoid embarrassment. We also found a sense of distrust within and between demographic groups and teams, and this presents a really serious challenge when you're talking about establishing practices to name and explore sensitive issues around race. So in the report, we offer more detailed recommendations about things like source tracking and universal source lists, among others. Regarding editing practices, we suggested that editors, particularly white editors, take responsibility for building their own cultural competency and don't just lean on colleagues of color. We also noted that there have been some good efforts made to explore what they called story autopsies or a gut check Slack channel. And we'll hear in a little bit about how the Seattle Times has been doing a similar effort for a while now. We suggested deepening community engagement through options like a standing community advisory group and accountability conversations. And then finally, we underlined the importance of workplace equity initiatives around hiring opportunities and pay, and encouraging accountability by incentivizing goals around diversity, equity, and inclusion and community engagement. That's a very short version, and I'm going to hand it off now to the Inquirer's Jessica Parks, who can update us on what the Inquirer started doing already in response to this.
Yeah, thanks, Andrea. Happy to answer questions from anyone in this session or after. We have just a short amount of time. So the first thing I wanted to note is that the audit was completely independent. So no one outside of our 5 people who were consulting actually saw it before it came out. But the reaction largely was that it confirmed what we already knew to be the case, and it validated some of the work that we were already doing on the working groups to assign specific things that we wanted to work on. We had a lot to be done once the audit was actually released and we could dig into it. So a lot of the first things that we had to do were just to talk about it, to process it. It was very emotional when it was released. There was a lot to dissect, and there were some additional insights and recommendations that we had not assigned out yet. So that's what we're in the process of doing now. We have already restricted the use of mugshots. We launched our Slack channel, which Corinne is going to talk more about what they did in Seattle, but we modeled it largely after what they did there. And we are prioritizing and assigning now to the working groups a number of the specific recommendations that were contained in the audit.
Thank you, Jessica. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing. And so we're going to have time for Q&A and discussion about this in a little bit, but we're going to truck right along and talk about the next Newsrooms initiative, because these are all in conversation with each other. Everyone is doing something that kind of complements and relates in different ways. So we're going to next hear about another approach to source demographic audits that I think uses some different strategies that we can learn a lot from. Jennifer Dargan, I apologize, I forgot to ask pronunciation properly. Jennifer Dargan is the Ideas Network Assistant Director at Wisconsin Public Radio, and I'll let her share what they've been up to.
Thank you. So a while back, Wisconsin Public Radio started really thinking about how we can track the demographics of our sources. And so in 2015, we first experimented with the educated guess approach for our talk show guests. So we would research and use publicly available data to record mostly gender and race of our guests. And then 2019, we were having some conversations about it and just decided it wasn't passing the gut check test, and we weren't feeling right about making these, even though, researched and educated guesses, but we might be missing parts of people's identity. So in 2019, we launched, we started working on our source demographics projects to ask the sources themselves how they identify. And there was some feelings about this, about like, well, maybe people are going to be offended if we ask them. And I would just really want to tell you, we have not had a single complaint about people receiving a survey and being like, why are you asking this? I'm offended. I don't want to answer. We haven't had any. Those are all unfounded assumptions. So here's how it works. So every time a source is on air on Wisconsin Public Radio, the reporter or the producer, if it's a talk show, they will enter their name and their email address into the back end of our website, and it connects to the segment or the news piece that they were featured in. And then after they were on air, but every 2 weeks, we send out batches of surveys, and it's really short, literally a minute to fill out. 6 questions, asks about race, ethnicity, gender, zip code, age, and all of the answers are optional. So if someone does, feel uncomfortable sharing one piece of their identity, they don't have to, and we still hopefully will encourage them to get the survey results. We were talking to some folks at Minnesota Public Radio who did a similar thing, and heard that they got a response rate of 40%. And we were like, that would be great. That would be amazing if we got 40%. We're hoping for that. And we have been really happy because our response rate is usually around 45. It's eked up to around 50%, but usually hovers around 45%. And that means that we have really meaningful data to work with here from our results. We take into account each time a source is on air. Sue Robinson, who's on this call, may have been a guest on Wisconsin Public Radio more than once, but we would only survey her once and reconnect that data each time. So by September of 2020, we had collected a year's worth of data, and we decided we were ready to share it publicly and talk about, here's where we are, here's our baseline, and here's what we need to do, here's our plan to improve. And I think a link to that was shared in advance of this, and I'm happy to put it in. Oh, did you just put it in the chat? Yeah, it's in the chat. Awesome. So in that report, you'll see that we have an even amount of men and women now, and a small fraction of folks who identify as non-binary or gender non-conforming. And that's a really great improvement. So from when 2015, we were doing this educated guess method, we had 65% men on our talk shows. And then you'll see that 88% of our sources over the year identified as white. And that's something that we absolutely need to work on, and we've been taking action on. So we're trying to figure out, when do we achieve success with this? The Wisconsin census data reports that our state is 81% white. And so 88, 81, like, oh, 9% will be good. I don't think it's that simple at all. That maybe is one milestone that we can get past. But if you break it down by city, Milwaukee is 35% white, and another city in Wisconsin, Chippewa Falls, is 99% white. So it's just not that simple. And we are in the United States, which has its own demographics, which I don't have off the top of my head, but it's just, we're not sure when we're going to be able to have a party and have success. Probably never. Like, maybe it's just always an ongoing thing that we are working with, trying to improve here. So our plan for improvement includes naming one of our existing staff members as a source librarian, and that's Hannah Hayes. And she manages a Rolodex that we share across departments, and it's gotten us out of the "this is my source, this is your source" mentality. And it helps reporters find people more quickly, people with identities underrepresented in our data, and it helps us with, especially with deadline work. Another piece that we did is we created, one of our colleagues, Maureen McCollum, created a toolkit that is around diversity, equity, inclusivity. And it not only has a lot of information on how to diversify your sources, but how to do less extractive reporting for marginalized communities. Another piece that we do is we talk about our demographics of our guests almost every day in our editorial meetings. In our talk shows especially, we look back at yesterday, we say, okay, this show that happened, what's the breakdown of the show? And, this is, again, the educated guess method until we get the actual data back. But they're talking about it every day, so they can, if they find a day that is missing a piece that we are really trying to improve the demographics of, that they can make up for that in coming shows. One other piece I want to mention is we are part of the University of Wisconsin, and we have a lot of great academics at University of Wisconsin. We're committed to having them on and hearing their stories. And, we need to look at that. Like, is this piece of sources that we are going to repeatedly, what is that demographic breakdown? What is the demographic breakdown of our legislature? Because of course we're going to continue to talk to them. So I would encourage you to think about what groups of people you're committed to going to and you're committed to reporting on, and are they kind of hampering efforts where you have to change things out in other places if we just need to talk to, a political scientist rather than this legislator that wrote this bill. And the next piece that we really want to do, and Tim touched on this a little bit with the Inquirer, is we want to be able to cross-reference and overlay the data. Tim was talking about how they looked at it by desk. We don't have that ability right now to do that. So we could, great, we reached, sort of equity with men and women, but are we talking to women about gardening and men about politics? We don't know that. We don't have the data overlaid right now. So that's the next step that we want to do. And a content analysis as well, like who you talk to is important, but how you talk about it and what you talk about is important. And then after a second year, next August, we plan to share the data again, and hopefully we've moved the needle enough to be proud of what we did in this past year. And that is all I have. Yeah.
Thank you, Jennifer. That's great. And we're getting some great questions in the chat. Keep them coming. And we're just going to hear from one more Newsroom's experience. So as we've heard already, sort of reference to this idea of a Slack channel, as Jessica mentioned, it's drawn inspiration from the Seattle Times effort. So I want to introduce Corinne Chin, the senior video journalist and diversity inclusion lead from the Seattle Times, to share more about their efforts.
Thanks, Andrea, and thank you all for having me. I'm always really glad to see some familiar faces and so many new names as well. So a little bit of background on the Seattle Times and when we started this. I want to say I believe it was 2017 when we started this, and that was also the year that the Seattle Times was participating in the Night Lenfest newsroom initiative, also known as Table Stakes, which I know many of you have been through. And the gist of it, all you really need to know if you haven't heard of this, is that this was a period of time when the Seattle Times was really, really focusing on ramping up our digital subscriptions and really transforming, quote unquote, into a newsroom that's really supported by audience. So part of that is setting goals around subscription, circulation, newsletters. And as part of that, we said, well, if we are trying to be sustainable into the future as a business, we really need to do a better job of engaging with more diverse audiences, as most papers do. So one thing this was also, remember back to 2017, this was kind of early days of Slack adoption, I think, in many newsrooms. And for us, I think that was the year that we really started using it. And it was growing pains for when Slack was used. And I'm really glad we did it before we all went remote and everything is on Slack. So that's just a little background information. You know, like a lot of, I think, innovations, ours came from a moment of crisis, in that we had published a headline that was, you know, I'll say racist. A lot of other people will call it a microaggression, but essentially we had published a freelancer story on a review of an album from a local musician. And unfortunately, our editor, you know, put in the headline, not the musician's name, not her band's name, but just referenced her as Macklemore's sidekick, because she had once sang backup at a Macklemore on a track. And she was Asian American. And this was right at the time when "Not Your Asian Sidekick" hashtag was going viral, in that Asian Americans are constantly depicted in media as sidekicks. You know, even Bruce Lee was a superhero sidekick to someone who was less skilled than him. So it was just really bad timing, and it went very, very viral. And the thing that for us that was so galvanizing to form this channel, I think, was seeing how our newsroom reacted to it, and seeing the non-apology apologies come out that had gone through too many layers of PR, and seeing how that really, instead of bringing us closer to our community and learning from those mistakes, it really drove that wedge because of how we responded. So we thought this was a terrible thing. Everybody felt terrible about it. You know, the people who made the mistake felt terrible about it, the people who were impacted. And we were just sitting in a task force meeting. How can we do this before we publish? How can we have these conversations before we publish instead of after? And how can we lessen this harmful impact and stop damaging trust with our audiences? So Lauren Frone, who's another video journalist, you know, at the meeting, she was like, why don't we just start a hotline so that if somebody's thinking about publishing something that might be sensitive, they can just call one of us who serves on this task force. And that's how it was born. And so it took, I would say, 2 good years to get up and running, to be totally productive, because I think a lot of a lot of the time it's really easy to take your mistakes personally, and that's the big danger, I think, for people who are thinking about starting this type of Slack channel now is I think there's a fine line between it being a call out channel that's counterproductive and something that's actually productive where we're all learning together. So the advice I would give is that it needs to have clear collaboration from the top and support from the top, but also be embraced by people working on the ground in the field. And we were lucky that the alchemy of things was that we just had that going in. But I would also recommend marketing it as this is a learning opportunity. And in a lot of ways, we often refer to it as professional development in our newsroom. And like I said, it took a while for us to get here, but especially as we're so isolated, I think it's really hard to get those learning opportunities where we're learning from each other. When we were back in the newsroom, we could listen to an amazing reporter and overhear their interview on the phone and learn so much from that. And all of that type of thing we're not getting anymore. So this is a way for us to say, actually, I read this article, or I was talking to this community member who brought up an issue with this term. Let's just say, for example, with AAPI flattening a lot and conflating a lot of groups, and then we can have a conversation in the Slack channel. So really pushing it as learning together, as a non-judgmental space, and especially as please put your stories in here first, because it tends to get ugly if a mistake is made and people need to confront people after. We also don't really, I get a lot of questions about this. We don't use a Slack channel too much to correct something after the fact because of how it can become a pile-on. And we do have a workflow for if you see something problematic get published, here's the order of operations of who you go to. If this person's not available, you go to and generally it's, the managing editor, the editor of the piece, the person who wrote the piece, just to have guidelines there. And then the last thing I'll say is that I think I forgot to mention actually the mechanics of this, but at the beginning, we had a core group of people who listed their phone numbers and were available, and we would trade off, I'll have my notifications on this week, Lauren will have her notifications on next week, and have a rotation. And that just became a little bit tedious. And because we were lucky and that the newsroom was engaging with the channel and using it, at this point, anybody can post in the channel and anybody can respond in the channel. Like, we don't anoint people, Corinne's gonna respond about like Asian issues. It's not like that at all. It's just anyone who has the time and the space to help a colleague can chime in. And so we wanted to make sure that people of color weren't shouldering the burden of all of the work. And so we created a form that when you do a back read, you can fill it out. You can say how much time did you spend on it? Were your suggestions taken into account? Did the changes get made? Who did you talk to? So we just want to track how much time is being spent so that it's not, one staffer spending hours and hours on this. And if we do see that happening, then we can kind of correct that. So I'll post some links in the chat on a little more reading about how we did it. I do think the last takeaway I'll leave you with is that it's really, what this is not a tool per se, as much as a shift in our newsroom culture. And I think that would be my number one takeaway, is that it's not something you can just apply for everyone. You really have to take the temperature of the room, how people are feeling, will people use this, and then campaign basically like with everyone in the newsroom. It's about relationship building and making sure that people have the right mindset going into it.
Thank you so much, Corinne. That was really helpful. And so we're going to open this up for Q&A in just a second. And I think because I think we have quite a lot of great questions and not a huge group, we're probably just going to have one big discussion today instead of doing our normal breakout groups. But before we do that, I wanted to give a shout out to Carolyn Bauman from Chalkbeat, who's here, who's leading a new initiative that relates to all of this. And we'll post a link to in the chat. But Carolyn, do you want to just say quickly what that's all about?
Yeah, hi everyone, I'm Caroline with Chalkbeat. We're a nonprofit news organization. We report on schools. We have small bureaus in 8 states and a national team. So 2 years ago, we started having conversations with WHYY. We were watching Wisconsin Public Radio and Minnesota Public Radio. So it's fun to be a part of this dialogue. In regard to source auditing, we were trying to figure out our own system for a really small and dispersed team. And the conversations that we started showed us that how to do source diversity auditing well is a conversation a ton of newsrooms are having. They're having them, the conversations are siloed, even with forums such as this. A lot of people are talking about this, but there's no kind of shared learnings. There's no industry-wide push, and there should be. And so we started thinking about that 2 years ago. We approached RJI about a year ago with this idea of we have a really specific need at Chalkbeat, but I would bet that a lot of other news organizations would benefit from whatever we design. Can we create a source diversity audit tool that's replicable for other newsrooms? We believe every newsroom should be worrying about this, caring about it, investing money and time into it, but that's not the way the world works. And so can Chalkbeat lead the way, hopefully in partnership with organizations that have been doing this already? So I think it's already in the chat, but we have just a post on Chalkbeat that details more about this specific part of the project we're in, which is kind of an audit of the audits. We want to take a really deep look at what other folks have done over time, what's worked well, what hasn't. And we also want to offer the opportunity for folks to sign up through a form, both to tell us what your newsroom has done with source diversity audits so we can have that conversation and learn from you. Or if your newsroom hasn't, but you personally are really interested in this work, or you think your newsroom should be interested in this work, still fill out the form so I know to follow up with you whenever we create whatever we're going to create, and hopefully it's something your newsroom can benefit from. So that's it from me, but glad to be here and excited about this work.
Thank you so much. I just want to acknowledge that there's a lot of people on this call who've been doing this work and leading the way on this work, and I'm so grateful for all of you for joining. And I'm really excited about this idea of tying some of this together, because I've already, just from doing the Inquirer project, I've heard from a number of newsrooms who are like, oh, we want to do this thing. And like, we really shouldn't be reinventing the wheels every time here. There must be some way of working together on this. So I'm going to hand it over to Jake to get us started with our Q&A here.
Okay, so there's already been a few questions that have been posted in the chat that I'm going to just start going through. But for everyone else, if you have questions, please start throwing them into the chat, and I will either put you on the spot and ask you to talk a little bit about it, or I'll just read it out loud. The first question I wanted to start with comes from Jessica, and it's about the response rate for Jennifer's, for the thing Jennifer was talking about. So Jessica, do you want to first, if you don't mind, could I put you on the spot and ask you to re-ask your question for everyone, and then Jennifer, if you'd answer it?
Sure. So I think I wanted to make sure I heard you correctly. I think you said the response rate was around 40%. Do you account for the others who didn't respond to it and recalculate your representation based on those who didn't respond?
No, we don't. We haven't done any sort of weighted measurement there. I'm not a statistician, but some people that have helped us with our data, our survey center, have looked at it and said that it's statistically significant, and we can draw conclusions from it. And when we talk about it, we talk about the fact that we are talking about the data in terms of the people who responded. And really it's, other than anecdotally, which some of the talk shows have done, like just double checking, like who's responding. Does it tend to be more white males that are responding? And they've kind of spot checked some areas of it. I think we'd really have to dive into it with someone that knows this sort of thing a lot better than I do. But when we talk about the data, we said we are analyzing the results of the people who have responded.
Andrew, I see you don't have your video on, so I hope you don't mind me putting you on the spot. If you do, feel free to just say so, and I'll just read your question out loud. But you had a really interesting question about finding common ground when it comes to language and partnerships. Do you want to expand on that at all?
Yes, I apologize. I'm not on video. I'm having breakfast at the same time doing this. I've been on calls since 6 a.m. But Yes, as you know, as newsrooms are doing more collaborations with both partners that are inside and outside of newsrooms, I'm curious how the group is viewing finding like a common shared purpose, common shared language, and understanding in how we approach this work, because some people might be extremely uncomfortable with the fact that we're asking for, you know, pretty stark and not stark information, but, you know, information that some people might consider to be personal. So I'm just curious, like how the group is viewing that and how they would approach it.
I mean, I'll respond if you're interested. Like I manage a team of reporters at WHYY, where our newsroom director, Sandy Clark, has been having us do this for 3 years. And I think at first our reporters were apprehensive and felt anxious about asking people. But I think it's at this point, people are very accustomed of talking about their identity, and it's not, I think if you don't make it seem weird, it's not weird to people. And so we've just given people language to use, like, hey, you know, we're doing this project where we're just thinking a lot about the diversity of people we talk to. Do you feel comfortable telling us how you identify yourself? And then they usually say, oh, and I'm a white woman. Or you say, you know, is there a gender identity that you use? Is there a racial identity that you use? And people kind of identify that way. And then we also sort by like how we're using these sources. So like, are we only talking to people from certain groups who are experts? Are we only talking to certain people? Are we only using certain groups in like a victim or character capacity, you know, to ensure that like we have diversity, not only in all the sources, but in all ways, like people are being represented in all ways across. So, I mean, I think all these efforts are really awesome, and that there's a growing comfort in talking about this stuff.
I can jump in and say same experience. We have people thanking us for asking and for paying attention to it, and haven't had anyone complain to us that we are doing it. And thank you for mentioning the, we do have another thing that we track. We don't ask our sources, but we track it on our end, is like what role are they playing? Same kind of thing that you mentioned, like, you know, elected official, community voice, academic, author, things like that. And we track that so we can, for ourselves, have a better understanding of what roles people are playing and who we are talking to. We also have given our reporters and producers some language, and some of them even put it in their signature line. Just, you know, something like WPR is committed to understanding and expanding the diversity of perspectives on air. And to that end, we're going to ask you these questions. And we also, I didn't share this before, but we also say that the data will not be shared with their name attached. So we give them a little reassurance that way.
Yeah, and the reason why I asked the question is because as we're doing more of these partnerships and we're putting together MOUs with, again, people who might be familiar with journalism, might not be familiar with journalism and the intent of what we're trying to do, finding that almost boilerplate stuff that you're talking about, putting at the end of the email, I think would be interesting to see and share. So thank you.
Oh, sorry. Was someone else about to jump in? No? Okay. I want to jump now to a question that Joy asked during the Philadelphia Inquirer audit presentation. And I was really excited about this question because it selfishly totally interacts with my interest in how journalists think about their audiences and what those assumptions do to shape how news gets produced. So Joy, could I ask you to either read your question out loud or just re-ask it for everyone else?
Yeah, as long as the dog here stops barking. I am always super interested, as Jacob is, in how we sort of conceive of audiences and describe them. And so my instinct is to want to applaud editors who say, you know how people might respond to this, we should be cautious of that. And yet, of course, if you feel like that editor is maybe less aware than you are or has limited awareness, that could be really frustrating. So my question for the Inquirer folks was whether, or for Andrea, was whether the pushback when editors, the frustration when editors were saying, rewriting stories with audience perceptions in mind, whether that was because the perception was that the editor was wrong, or that the editor was considering just, just white audiences or just certain audiences, or if it was something else.
I mean, I can speak to other Inquirer folks who want to jump in, please do, but I can just speak to, in terms of the people I spoke with, particularly the BIPOC reporters that I talked to and had the concerns I heard. It was mostly that the editors were just thinking about white people, and that there was also a connection between white people and white subscribers. There's a traditional subscription base and an idea about that, and so that it was an assumption that everything has to be explained for white people.
For the paying subscribers, for the paying customers, and for longtime customers. Yeah, and it wasn't necessarily even, I mean, I think, and Jessica could speak more to how much it was accurate, but it was just an idea that the default was the white audience, and that they were the ones who had to be explained to, and not vice versa. And so that was a huge felt frustration for those journalists.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of recognition now among the editor ranks that people were not aware of their blind spots. A lot of that is coming up, and we're having a lot of conversations now also, at the business level and in performance management and analytics and other things we're doing about the difference between the audience we have and the audience we want to have. And we have been catering everything for a long time to the audience we already have, and that becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So that's something, I don't want to pretend like we have solved that, but at least we're talking about it now.
And I'll just add that there's a lot of recommendations to do more community engagement work, so that is definitely not something we want to poo-poo. We want to get people to think about community more than, that's not necessarily just about audience, but about community in a way that could potentially benefit, the audience that they want to have too.
And I can add on that a little. I don't remember what the exact, interviewee said in the report, but I think one example that, I heard from several colleagues is, like, for example, when they use, like, if a colleague is like a person of color, and they use like terminology or language that, members of that group would use, but, white audiences would use a different term for something, the editor would want to change it to the more quote unquote common term. And I think that's like a larger question, right? Of, who our audience is, and like when we have like in-group language and, whatever, like who are we trying to speak to, and what do we see as like the role in terms of, should we be trying to explain things for certain people, or, whatever. So I guess that was, one of the things I've heard in that vein.
Ariella, you're trying to ask something.
Sorry, I have a related question. Can you talk a little bit more, Jessica or Timothy or anyone from the Inquirer, about how you're training editors?
I would say that's still a work in progress. Right now, what we're doing is we're talking about it a lot. And we've had Maynard come in, we've had the Dart Center come in, we've done a lot of workshops and like talking about fault lines, talking about bias training. But I think we're still struggling to get them to do the work, as opposed to having people ask for, oh, what can you give me to get me up to speed on this? Like, it's our responsibility to make them culturally competent. And I think we're still having to, in some cases, we're still having to change minds on that. And if anyone else has other recommendations or anything to add on that, I would love to hear it.
Arielle, I know you've been doing some work in this area, if you wanted to share anything about that.
Yeah, we're working on this same kind of issue at WHYY, and I don't have the answer. We've done trainings with Maynard and trainings with a number of people. One thing that I've been working on coordinating is more kind of like anti-racism training that doesn't operate on a journalism specific axis, and is more looking like a more personal conversations and more kind of like deep anti-bias work around just our lives. And I feel like and that has been, that's a work in progress, I think. But I was just curious about other people are, if you're finding, because I found with our newsroom, I think that you can talk about the professional elements of it and go through all these trainings without really shifting your, feeling like, oh, I get it, I understand, I'm not going to use that word, or like, no, but the deep work on like really resetting isn't happening. So I'm interested if newsrooms have worked with any trainers that aren't necessarily from journalism related centers, but have worked with journalists.
So we're doing that now. We have done, the Maynard, the Fall Lines, the Dart, all of those things. And we are doing one now with a local kind of equity consultant who worked in the Seattle Public Schools for years. And it's a series. And we actually had planned this for a long time, but we didn't actually start it until the pandemic. So it's all been on Zoom. And one thing we found with this training, I think it's just a happy coincidence, but it's one of the few outlets that a lot of our colleagues have to connect with each other in the breakout rooms. She does a lot of the time. There's no kind of scheduled time for that. Our newsroom meetings are just not structured in a way where we have a lot of small group time. So a silver lining of it, I think people are receiving it differently because of that, and because they're getting those kind of social benefits in a time when we are lacking in that. Whereas previous trainings have felt very much like mandatory training, anything that's kind of compulsory. I think people will always have a backlash too. So I'll say that about the training we're doing now. I'm not sure if it's as much the format, as much as not specifically being about journalism, as much as in 2020, everyone's more interested in getting more educated. So I think it's a mix of things that this is being a little more successful than our previous attempts. But I'll also say, back to the theme of newsroom culture, one thing that we have been doing for a couple years, maybe 3 years, is a book club called ST Reads. And the first book we read was White Fragility before it kind of exploded. And we had, I don't know, maybe 15 or 20 people sign up for that round. And then we did So You Want to Talk About Race when that came out. And that's a local Seattle writer. We had a little more participation. And then, of course, this summer, we had huge participation. We watched 13th together, and we did a discussion after that. We had like 50 people in that discussion, and it was on Zoom. And we're currently reading How to Be an Anti-Racist now that everybody can get it from the library, because it was constantly out before. And it wasn't explicitly marketed as here's a race-related book club, and we didn't really start it that way. It was about blind spots and just having a different way to talk about these things outside of the context of work. But based on what people were interested in and what books people wanted to read, that's sort of what it's become. And I think that's been a real success for us.
Something else I want to add, Carolyn put in the chat that she wonders how much really changes out changes in leadership. I think, Jessica, correct me if I'm wrong, I think our company is starting to look at desks that need that either don't have people of color as editors, or increasing the number of editors of color or of different backgrounds on certain desks. I don't know if there's specifics for which desks or roles. I think some of that might be internal promotions too, but I think that's something that beyond training as newsrooms have to be aware of, is that if you don't have a diverse set of editors, you can train people all you want, but that's it's not going to replace the value that people bring from their lived experiences and backgrounds. I think the other thing is that our gut check Slack channel, I think some editors are being proactive about using that as just a way that even if they don't think there's a specific quote unquote problem with a story before it's published, like they will just post it in there and just kind of ask for feedback, and are open-minded about whether they might have blind spots, and they're just being proactive about that. And I think those discussions can also be productive in helping. It's not like a training, but I think when you have those discussions, it helps editors and reporters and everyone else in the newsroom kind of just be aware of some of those things. And I think those are really helpful, because they're kind of like, you're learning on the go, and it's not just you're sitting in a Zoom room or whatever listening to someone talk. So I think that is a good benefit of that Slack channel for us.
I should add too, thanks for mentioning that, Tim. That's really, really important. I think most of our, all of our conversations are pretty much that. It's an editor or a reporter saying, I don't know if there are issues with this story. I don't even know if there's a debate in this community, but posting it and then we talk about it and learn about it. And we've had a lot of style changes come out of that channel. So I saw Jessica posted about the explanatory comma a little bit earlier. And this is something we've been debating all the time about clarity versus, are we othering, or can we help to normalize something that should have been normalized a long time ago? And those conversations come up like, do we need the explanatory comma here? And then we have the bigger conversation about, do we ever need the explanatory comma? Is it more harmful than helpful? And those are the best conversations that come out of that. It's not necessarily a corrective conversation that I would say is the best thing to come out of that channel.
So I think that this is a really great segue to a question that Sue asked, and also probably a really great last question since we're winding very down on time. Since we're talking now, it seems about what actually changes as a result of these important conversations and efforts. Sue, do you want to either read your question or re-ask it for everyone?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, really great presentation. Super inspiring about what everybody's doing. Curious if anybody has looked specifically at content after these D&I initiatives, beyond like, oh, there are more sources of color, there are more females or whatever. Wondering if you saw any substantial sort of content change in framing, or if you've even had a chance to look at that for anybody of these newsrooms that are doing this work.
Very good question. I mean, the one newsrooms I know of haven't quite had time to do that yet. And the problem is like a lot of times this work will be funded as a project, and then you'll get to do this little piece of research, but you'll never have follow-up. Unless like you're working with a particular academic who has the opportunity to do that. And I certainly aspire to kind of do that in some of these projects, but it's, I don't think systematically we have structures that support that, which is a real problem. But maybe someone else has done this work and I don't know about it.
I'll just add, work for the Inquirer. We had some interesting conversations in one of our audit features audit groups about a story we did on some shootings in West Philadelphia, which is just a kind of standard story we've done over the years. And it was a really good story for what it was, explain all kinds of forces and why there were a rash of shootings. Instagram gangs, the kids who died were on their way up. It was a lot of things, but then it was a discussion in terms of, is this an example of the tropes? We're falling back on tropes. Should we be doing this story? And then another question that came up that I found really interesting was, even if we say, okay, it's a story we have to do, should we have had 3 reporters on it for several weeks, which is kind of what happened. And it was, so the question shifted to resources, which I think in the last time it was like defunding, should we be defunding police reporting, So that's a kind of issue, I think, of a shift in mindset. Like, why is this kind of story maybe valid? Maybe there's different ways to do it, but we don't want to not do it. But does it really require all those resources? Or would some of those resources be better in different kinds of stories?
I'll just add that I think anecdotally, I've heard some people say that just the process of doing something like a source audit is an intervention in itself, and that it's led to conversations happening within teams about doing a particular story differently. And so I think that there is something going on there. I just don't know that it's been systematically tracked.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I think, hearing about the audits and source audits, I've been wanting to do this for a really long time. And I think just in Seattle, we haven't found the right partnership to pull that stuff off. So we haven't been tracking the before and after. Anecdotally, I see a lot of changes. But the one thing I'll say is that the one thing we do track, and it's informal, it's just a volunteer member of staff. She goes through, Taylor Blatchford, who writes the lead for Pointer for student journalists. She will sometimes go through the last few Sundays and see, just do a A1 audit because we can't do the whole paper. And what we're seeing is that it's still super white and super male. So even though we have this great book club, we've got the Slack channel, we have all sorts of things going on. We have a sentiment survey, we have this and that. When you actually look at the data, I don't know that our coverage is changing fast enough. So I think we need to take all the puzzle pieces we talked about today and put them all together and hopefully speed things up a little bit.
Thank you, Corinne. I'm afraid we're pretty much out of time here, and there's some great questions in the chat that we haven't quite gotten to everything. There's been some conversation in the chat there, so hopefully at least a lot of things have been going on and being addressed. But I want to thank everybody for taking the time to join us. We're going to send around the video and the chat itself because there's a lot of great resources and links in that. Go ahead and save it yourself if you want, but we'll try to send that around in a follow-up note. And we'll also update you in terms of future conversations we're going to have. I think if nothing else, this was a great opportunity to kind of get some sense of what people are doing, and hopefully there can be some connections and follow-up from this. Am I missing anything, Jake?
No, I don't think so. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to everyone who presented, and thanks for everyone for all these awesome questions. And sorry if we didn't get to your question, I'm sorry about that. Robin, you were next, but we ran out of time. But it's nice to see you.
And check out Carolyn's the opportunity to connect with her, and hopefully we don't all have to keep reinventing these wheels, and we can share resources in a way that is more helpful for everyone. So thanks everyone. I'm so grateful for all of you for joining. A lot of wonderful folks here with great experiences, and hope to see you next month. Well, actually next month we'll be talking about efforts to address how crime coverage could be reimagined, including with some folks from Free Press. So we'll share more details on that, and then also about the AEGMC pre-conference coming up in August. But thanks again so much, and you have a great day. Thanks for joining us. Bye. I'm gonna stop recording.